watching tonight. This is Mark's Mouthpiece, and tonight my guest is Ron Modell. Ron is a former principal trumpet of the Dallas Symphony and former professor of music at Northern Illinois University. And I wanted to thank my sponsors tonight, Euclid IQ. You can see them at euclidiq.com, and they are the world's leading, the industry leader in audio and video compression, as well as Dylan Music. If you'll go to dylanmusic.com for all your brass needs, and if you give them the code DULAN5, you'll get a 5% discount. So without any further ado, Ron, it's a pleasure to finally have you on here.
Well, thanks, Mark. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great, and I'm really excited about this interview because I don't know any trumpet player I've ever met with a more diverse background than you. So I just
we had to make a living.
That's,
we had to make a living. That was the problem.
Yeah, exactly. It still is, but not the same way.
I want to show everybody my new Christmas sweatshirt that I got. I'm going to stand up for a minute. Can you see it?
I love it.
That comes from my beautiful daughter, Lisa Marie, and her husband, Neil, in Scotland, in Herseth, Scotland. And then I have another beautiful daughter who lives in Rome, New York, who gave me this. How does this look, Mark?
Hold it up just a little bit more so they can see it. Sorry, and just a little higher, tooted.
Isn't that fantastic?
Yes.
I love them both. That's from Lisa Robin.
Yes, I love that. Hey, so Ron, we have so many crazy things to get through. I wanted to see if you could talk about your start in music.
Well, when I was 7 years old and my older brother, rest him, Sandy, was 10, my mother decided to take Sandy for trumpet lessons to a very well-known trumpet teacher at that time in Manhattan named Bert Pinino. And after 20 minutes of Sandy not being able to make a sound on the trumpet or the mouthpiece, and me being a little 7-year-old pain in the you-know-where, kept saying, let me try. And finally, Pinino said, let him try. And I played immediately. And so Pinino said, don't teach him, teach him. Well, then I really never started formal study till I was 10 years old. And my first teacher, having two great trumpet players in my family, my uncle Milty Davidson and Louis Davidson. Louis was a principal trumpet in Cleveland from 1935 to 1958. And Milty was principal in the Dallas Symphony in about 46, 47 with Dorati. So I was always being given the best teachers. And I went to Jimmy Smith, lived on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And he started me on a book for a whole year by Edwin Franco Goldman. That was my beginning book. The second year I was transferred over to a guy who was the fourth trumpet in the New York Philharmonic named Saul Lubalin. And he was on that very, very famous New York Philharmonic recording made in 1928 of Ein Heldenleben with Wilhelm Mengelberg conducting. And that trumpet section was Harry Glantz playing first, Max Schlossberg playing second, Frank Venezia, who was later to become a teacher of mine, Saul Lubalin, and another guy named David Glickstein. And from there, I went a year later at age 12. And by the way, on these lessons, like when I was 12, you wouldn't dare do this now, but at 12 years old, living in East Bronx, I had to take 2 buses to get to Flushing, Long Island, and study with a wonderfully old, kind man named Joe Ruscino. Joe Ruscino had been third and assistant first trumpet at the Metropolitan Opera from 1919 to 1949. And the only book we used the entire year was a book called Rhythmical Articulation by Pasquale Bona. At the end of the year, I had my very first piece of solo music, and that was the Inflammatus of Rossini. And then I went to the one teacher that I think probably did the most for me. I mean, really kicked my ass. He really did. And his name was Murray Karpolewski. He had been principal trumpet in the Pittsburgh Symphony during Reiner's time. And then he went to New York and he was on Symphony of the Air. In fact, he and my Uncle Milty played a Sunday night show for United States Steel called the Theater Guild of America. And the program started with a unison trumpet fanfare that I memorized immediately, and it was just great to hear them. But Murray was the one that got me into all the difficult books, you know, after Arbin and, you know, Chaban, Chalier, everything. And then after that, it wasn't until I had been playing professionally that I had always had a problem with endurance and with high playing. I was good up till about an E above high C. And by the way, my first mouthpiece was my Uncle Milty taking me to Mount Vernon Bach factory and them laying out a black velour cloth with about 30 mouthpieces on it. And my Uncle Milty said, just keep trying one until it feels comfortable. And I ended up with a 7B Bach trumpet mouthpiece, and played that for 20 years. In the 60s, when I was in the Dallas Symphony, I was very fortunate. Bud Herseth had a sister that lived in Dallas. So every other summer or whatever, he'd come out for a visit. And of course, I would have him up for lunch at my place. And one day, Bud said to me, what kind of mouthpiece do you play? And I said, well, I played a 7B since I started. And he said, can I see it? I said, sure. So I gave it to him and he said, here's a mouthpiece. It was a Bach 1.5B. He said, I want you to try this mouthpiece for 3 weeks. And I said, okay, can I have my 7B back? He said, no. He said, once you get in trouble, you're going to run right back to this 7B. I'm guaranteeing you that 3 weeks on the 1.5B is going to open your sound, give you better endurance and a nicer sound and so forth. And of course it did, you know, and I stayed on that for another 20 years and until I was at the university teaching, and then I switched over to a 3B. So my entire trumpet life was a 1.5B, a 3B. I finished up with a 3B. So 7B, 1.5B, 3B. Now, if I had to play something high, and I never owned the piccolo trumpet, I did the Mass in B minor on a D trumpet that my uncle had given me, a little Holton D combination C. It had a set of C slides. And I did that on a 1.5B, which was absolute idiocy. But anyway, you know, I got to be where, when I graduated high school, I went immediately out on the road for 8.5 months with a wonderful, wonderful actress who did a one-woman show. Her name was Cornelia Otis Skinner, and the name of the show was Paris 90. It was a one-woman show. She was on stage for 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 20 minutes. And she did 15 different characters in the year 1890 in Paris. And the score was written by Richard Rogers' daughter, Mary. And it was in the style of Offenbach. And we carried 3 musicians, and every town we came into, we added 8 other musicians. And the one story that came out of that was before I left home, my 2 uncles gave me a list of names after they saw the tour itinerary and said, when you get to this town, call this person and get them tickets. Call this, you know. So when we got to Denver, the great Saul Kasten, who was the principal trumpet of the Philadelphia Orchestra during the early days with Stokowski and Normandy, I invited him to the show. And unbeknownst to me, it was a Saturday night. I took him backstage and introduced him and so forth. And then we left on the train to go to LA. He called Eugene Normandy and said, I want you to hear this young man. I was 18 years old at the time. So 6 months into the tour, when we were in Milwaukee, I got a call from a man who simply identified himself as the manager of the Philadelphia Orchestra and wanted to know the earliest time I could come and audition for Maestro Ormandy. That audition took place in March at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel where Ormandy lived. I owned one trumpet. It was a pre-war French Besson, medium bore, B flat, and the man came in with a pile of music, the first piece being Symphony Domestica of Richard Strauss. And Ormandy said to me, play the opening call, which being 18, very brash young man, I nailed it to the wall. And he said to me, can you do that again? I said, yes. And I nailed it to the wall. And then he went through the whole part and then proceeded for an hour and a half. Can you imagine playing an hour and a half audition with everything in the repertoire? And when I finished the audition and I was leaving, I was at the door, and Ormandy said, you have an innate sense of playing everything musically correct. So I had to wait till I got home to find out what innate meant. I had no idea what the word meant, really. He said to me, you have to go to a smaller orchestra like Houston, Dallas, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and get 3 to 5 years experience learning the repertoire, and then call me. And exactly 5 years to the day, I called him, and I'll never forget his voice on the phone saying, oh, my young man, I'm so sorry. 3 weeks ago, I engaged Gil Johnson from New Orleans. So it's always been at the right place at the right time. But let me have you talk for a while.
Oh, no. I was just letting you go. Well, I wanted to take a step back. Could you talk about your Uncle Milty and Louis a little bit more? And
Oh, I would love to. Those were two of my idols, and I tried to emulate everything that they did, and they were different. They were both sweet as sugar and giving. My mother, who was their older sister, never had to lie for Louis, because when Louis got home, he would pick up his trumpet and practice 3 or 4 hours right after school. Milty would come home, put his books down, pick up his baseball glove, and he was gone for the rest of the day. And when Papa Davidson, my grandpa Davidson, would come home and ask my mother, did Milton practice? She'd have to lie. She'd say, oh, yeah. Because Schlossberg, who they both studied with, in fact, when my Uncle Louis took his lesson, his very first lesson, there was a guy playing before him and was so fantastic that Louis said when he went in to play for Schlossberg the first time, he froze up. He couldn't play. He had heard Manny Klein. Manny Klein was taking a lesson with Schlossberg. Anyway, my grandfather Davidson told me that Uncle Louis, whenever he came for his lesson, he always played it so beautifully that Schlossberg would give him a dime, which the lessons cost $2. So he was getting his lesson for $1.90. But with Milty, Schlossberg told my grandfather one day, he said, if Milton was my son, I would beat him with a stick and make him practice, because he is the greatest natural talent I've ever had as a student, which was quite a compliment after the stable of students. But Milty was so tasty. Louis was strictly symphonic. Milty could play jazz, he could play club dates. He was a great symphonic trumpet player. And after he left Dallas, he had 2 years with Antel Durrani in Dallas. Then he left to become the principal trumpet and contractor in New York of the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. And I believe at the time, Anton Coppola was the conductor, and he stayed there for quite a while. And then he became principal trumpet of the New Jersey Philharmonic. They were just magnificent people. When you saw Milty walk into a room, it was like 1,000 lights were turned on. And Louis equally, they just were great people and great players. And they always were very kind to me. I mean, once in a while, I remember one time, you'll get a kick out of this. I came to Milty and I said, I was just reading a book on this new system of playing the trumpet. It was something by Donald Reinhardt about a pivot system or something like that. And I told him, and he listened to me. And then he said, shut up, put the trumpet up to your mouth, buzz your lips and blow air. After I gave him a big hurrah, But Milty passed on way too early. And Louis moved to California to be with his son Emil. And also passed on way too early for me. And we think about them really every day.
Yeah. And I mean, just a huge legacy both of those players had. And Louis, of course, we know from the Cleveland Orchestra recordings. And
Oh yeah, Brzezinski and Zellin. I have to tell you, Louis had one of the greatest lines ever. When Loren Mizell, the great conductor, was a child, he was a child prodigy. And they brought him to the Cleveland Orchestra summer season, which was held at Blossom Center. And he was about 10 or 11 years old, and he came out for his first rehearsal, had a little suit and tie on, and got up on the podium, looked at the orchestra and said, "Good morning. What shall we play first?" And from the back of the trumpet section came Louis saying, "How about cops and robbers?" It was wonderful.
Yeah. We were talking about this before, that Jimmy Smith studied with Schlossberg, as did Murray Kopylewski.
Kopylewski, yeah.
Yeah. And so between those four people, how much did you hear about Schlossberg other than what you just told us a minute ago?
Well, they all use the same method, I
Yeah.
think, that Schlossberg did, and the flexibility things and
Yeah.
It was like, I was always told, for instance, if you went to Claude Gordon in California, or you wanted to study with Bill Adam in Indiana University, those were the greatest teachers, in addition to Carmine Caruso in New York, that built up endurance, strength, high notes. But it was in that area alone. There was not, for instance, music, phrasing, and which was so great. I mean, if you can't play and have the strength and endurance and register, then you're not going to be able to make music.
Right.
So, but it was wonderful to have one of those kinds of choices of teachers.
Yeah.
So many great players, so many great teachers.
Did they talk about Schlossberg's mannerisms or what he was like as a person, or?
They never did to me.
Yeah.
To me, when you looked at his picture in his book, Daily Drills and Studies, he looks very stern. He looks very stern with his armature. Yeah, just, but he died 3 years after I was born, so I never got to meet him.
Right.
I would have loved to have met him.
Wow, that's amazing. And you were doing so much stuff so early. What was Vincent Bach like when you met him?
Well, Vincent Bach, my first year in the Tulsa Philharmonic, and also a freshman at Tulsa University, he came and, believe it or not, did 7 hours one day. He did 3 or 4 in the morning. And then after lunch, he did 3 more. And during the after lunch, he asked me to join him for a Coke in the student center. And again, here I am, barely 18 years old, still that young, brash kid. And he said to me during the course of our talk, he said, you and your 2 uncles, Louis and Milty, are only 3 of a handful of people in the entire symphonic region that don't play a Bach trumpet. Why is that? And I said, Mr. Bach, it's so stuffy when you first get it. And it takes about 4 or 5 years to break it in. And then I understand from the players I've talked to that you have a magnificent instrument. In my case, the conductors are not willing to wait 4 or 5 years to break in a trumpet. You got to play right now. So it was just a young kid. I could have been a lot more discreet.
And you were quite obviously a diverse player very soon too, because I wanted to kind of get into the things that you did in the summers, starting in 1950 when you were 15 years old in the Catskills. Can you kind of talk about some of those times and the people you were around?
I started, in 1950 in a small hotel in Ferndale, New York called Steers. And it only held 100 guests. And we would have 3 shows a week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And normally shows were a dance team, a singer, and a comedian. And I want to tell you, this little 5-piece band that I played in, who were all good musicians, but had no experience whatever, we would have 3 shows a week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And normally shows were a dance team, a singer, and a comedian. And I want to tell you, this little 5-piece band that I played in, who were all good musicians, but had no experience whatever, we we killed more acts than any other band, I think, ever in the Catskill. I didn't know what a Dalsenia was. I didn't know what a first ending was. I didn't know anything, nor did my colleagues, you know? So it took a year, but when we got up there the second year in Steers, I'd say we were one of the best show bands. We had learned through experience. And at that time, believe it or not, I was working with people like Lenny Bruce, the comedian, who at that time was doing a straight act, singing, imitations, singing, comedy, of course, but it was nothing like the comedy that we associate with Lenny Bruce. Buddy Hackett, Joey Bishop, Shecky Green. It was the training ground. It was like the minor leagues of show business. They were learning their craft. And just down the road, about 10 miles in a town called Woodridge, Sid Caesar was in the band. A few years before that, Jerry Lewis was a bellhop at Brown's Hotel in Loch Sheldrake, New York. Danny Kaye had been up there. So it was a real tremendous place. We were not treated well. We got very little money. We got room and board, and the food, of course, was the big attraction. Like if you go on a cruise today, my wife, my beautiful wife, Kathy, has always wanted to go on a cruise, and we did on our 3rd wedding anniversary. And then I tried to explain to her that a cruise to me was like being in the Catskill Mountains. The big attraction was food and entertainment, only it's on water. But basically that's what it was. So as I graduated from 100 guests, I ended up playing in the Concord Hotel in Kiamichi Lake, New York, which could actually hold 3,500 guests. Can you believe that? 3,500 guests. We had 5 bands. Machito was the Latin band. And we did shows with every name, the biggest names in show business. I remember one night doing a show with the great Sophie Tucker and Buddy Hackett acting as MCs. And really, every big name that you ever heard of came to the Concord Hotel. And then I started a long run at the Pines Hotel, which held 1,000 people. And again, it was just a marvelous, look, those symphonies in those days had 20-week seasons, 22-week seasons, 25-week. By the time I joined Dallas in 1960, I was married with a child, and my salary for 25 weeks was $160 a week. That was $4,000 for a year. Now, what was I supposed to do the other 27 years with a family? Thank God for the Catskills. I would go up there for 27 weeks or 25 weeks and play up there during the winter season, spring season, you know. And it was so much different because we had maybe 30 people during the week, but conventions would come up on the weekend. And so we were able to make a living. And that's where, you know, when I played so many wonderful people like Della Reese and Vic Damone and all the big names, and got this wonderful experience of learning how to play a show and doing a show.
Did you get to know any of those people you just talked about, Joey Bishop and Buddy Hackett? Were they kind of separate? Were they kind of separate from you guys?
No. They were very friendly, and they loved the musicians. I remember the night that Della Reese we rehearsed with her in the afternoon, and our first show on Saturday night used to start at 10 o'clock, and I come in at 9 o'clock, and she's sitting at the dressing table. She's drinking a milkshake and putting her makeup off, and I said, Miss Reese, did you know that your first show is at the Windsor Hotel, which was 1 mile away? She thought she was on the first show at the Pines. So she grabbed all her stuff, ran over to the Windsor, came back and did the late show. Anyway, that same night we had Buddy Greco, who was a great singer of that time. One did the early show, one did the late show. But every one of them was just great. You never heard any off-color stuff at that time. Yeah. Not any of them ever said anything off-color. In fact, when we had one night the greatest comedian, storyteller, I won't say comedian, storyteller, Jewish storyteller, because you know the clientele in the Catskills was 100% Jewish. And my favorite was a man named Myron Cohen. And just to give you an idea of a Myron Cohen story, he said this Jewish man used to go to a kosher restaurant every Friday night for his Friday night meal. For 30 years straight, he never missed. And he came in one night and he ordered the same thing for 30 years. He always started out with chicken soup with matzo balls. And when he came in that night, the waiter brought it to him. And the waiter was standing off to the side, and he noticed after 5 or 7 minutes that the Jewish man had not touched his soup. So he went over and he said, Mr. Cohen, are you feeling all right? He said, fine. He said, did your soup get cold? Can I have it heated up for you? He said, no, it's fine. Why don't you taste it? So the waiter looked and looked and looked, and he said, where's your spoon? He said, uh-huh. That kind of humor just killed me. But no, we had so much fun. It was like a family thing when you got up there. You know, you got to know all the acts, and it was, as I say, it was such a savior during that 18 summers that I played in the Tulsa Philharmonic and I played in the Dallas Symphony, to be able to go from one job to the other without interruption. One year I took off, and it was 1958, and that was my entrance into Latin music. I played with Joe Cuba at the Pines, and I played with Machito at the Concord. Machito was the greatest Afro-Cuban band, greatest Latin band, who spawned Tito Puente and Eddie Palmieri and all the great bands. They had all played with Machito. And sitting next to me was Doc Cheatham, one of the great trumpet players of his time, lived till he was 96, still playing the trumpet. But we had wonderful, wonderful experiences. I have to tell you, the three of my most embarrassing moments ever in my life. I played lead trumpet for Tony Bennett in the summer of '64. And his recording of I Left My Heart in San Francisco had just come out. And we were at the Statler Hilton in Dallas. And it was just incredible. And we do 2 sets a night. And in the first set was a tune called The Glory Road, which was kind of a gospel. And it started with 4 chords. The band would just play boom, and he would sing The Glory Road, boom, The Glory Road, 4 times in a row, and then we'd go into a gospel tempo. Well, on the 4th night, I don't know what got into me, but on the 3rd chord, I played it like I heard a cantor do with his voice one night in the synagogue. Instead of just playing boom, I went boy boom. And right in the middle of the show, Tony Bennett turned around and looked at me and said, I don't know what you did, but write it in, I love it. So then after the show, Tony Bennett came to me and he said, what did you do there? And I said, well, I heard a cantor do this with his voice one night. He said, did you write it in? I said, well, I don't know of any musical notation, but I wrote 2 words, think Jewish. Now it turns out that there is a musical thing called a doit, D-O-I-T, and if you put a curve going up, you get that doit, or if curved down the other way. So that was the one. And by the way, those 2 weeks with Tony, one of the greatest times of my entire career. Sweet, sweet man and a great, great talent. But my embarrassment came when he came back in September and did a one-nighter at Moody Coliseum on the campus of SMU. And he asked me to play lead. Well, then I didn't know at that time that sitting next to me was one of the greatest lead trumpet players I ever heard in my entire life. I knew he was playing first trumpet in the Fort Worth Symphony. His name was Don Thomas. And for me to play lead with Don Thomas sitting next to me, when I found out who he was and I know how he played, I was so embarrassed. I really was, because when I tell you, in my estimation, having heard all the greats through my career, Snooky Young and Maxwell and all of them, Don Thomas was incredible. And then when the Metropolitan Opera used to come through Dallas after our season was over, Mel Broyles, who was then the solo trumpet, would always invite me to be extra trumpet when they had any operas that required on stage or in the pit. And I asked him, can I take a lesson with you? Now, this is after many years of professional playing. So I went to the Melrose Hotel and we went into the big room there, and he sat way down at the end of the the part of the room. And I said, what would you like to hear? Expecting the Leonora calls or Don Juan or something. One of the most embarrassing, and I'm admitting it, and my face is probably red right now. He said, I want to hear an F sharp minor scale melodic, 2 octaves up and down. I couldn't play it. And he said, lesson over. That was it. And when I went back and thought about it, one of the many times I was with Bud Herseth, I remember Bud Herseth once telling me, if you know all your major and minor scale and chromatics, there shouldn't be anything that they put in front of you that you can't play. Now, he said, I won't include avant-garde music or 12-tone like that. But if you know your major, minor chromatic scales just as well as you know your name, nothing they'll put on the paper will be beyond you. And he was right, of course, you know. So right away, I started teaching that, you know, but I was very embarrassed. The other time was I was playing first trumpet in the Latin band at the Stevensville Lake Hotel in the Catskills. And when the show band would play, and it was the greatest show band in all of the Catskills, that's taking in 300 hotels. There was a leader named Mac Pollock, and he had this great band. A lot of the guys played on the Tonight Show when Skitch Henderson was directing it before they went to California. Anyway, the one thing, there are 2 things in my career that I never did. Number one, I never played the circus, because everybody that played the circus said, you start out the evening with the mouthpiece here, and you end up with the mouthpiece back here. And it was, you know, like 3 hours of just straight playing. And I didn't have the endurance for that. However, for 4 years straight, I did all of the playing for 2 or 3 weeks by myself on the book of the Ice Capades, which was very near the circus in, you know, playing one act right after another. But this night, this band, this show band was so great. Great jazz players, everyone. The other thing in my career that I totally take fault for and I regret, I never learned how to improvise. I was always a lead player. I wanted to, really bad, I wanted to, but I was not willing to give the time and the energy and stuff to study to learn how to play jazz. A couple of times I was put on the spot where I had to play. So I think of clinics that Clark Terry gave where he said, just find the root of the chord and then play the third and then play this. And I could get by, you know, a blues or something. But this night, I went to the piano player in the Latin band and I said, I want to play a jazz chorus because these guys play every night and they're great. So we took the tune Jeepers Creepers, which was in C, and he wrote out a whole chorus for me and I practiced it with him and it sounded great. So that night, when it came time to do Jeepers Creepers, I said, how about if I play a solo tonight, guys? And they said, fine. So we played the one chorus of the melody. I stood up very proudly and started to play my solo, which was right in front of me. The whole band went into B major. So every note I was playing was horrible, horrible. And they were all laughing their asses off, you know, they were just laughing and laughing. They had made a real fool out of me. So about 2 weeks later, I cornered one of them that was in sympathy for me. And every night we'd play a tune called How Deep is the Ocean? And the second trumpet had a little 4-bar solo at the end. And every single night I just played the melody. I never did anything different. Da, 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 da. And I said, write me out a 4-bar solo the way Dizzy Gillespie would play it. So he wrote out this incredible solo. So came that night, I stood up and played that 4-bar Dizzy solo, and all of them turned around completely amazed. And you know what they saw? This is what they saw. And I told them, F you. You know, that was a great revenge for me. That was marvelous, marvelous. I have to tell you a wonderful story about doing a week with Mel Torme back in the 80s in the Playboy Club in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Mel Torme was one of my 3 heroes in my life that just, if I learned anything about jazz and was able to develop a wonderful program at NIU, it was from hundreds of hours of listening to Mel Torme and Count Basie. I literally listened to hundreds of hours of Count Basie's band and Mel Torme with his dectet and different. Anyway, we became friends. We really became friends. So one night I went into Mel Torme's dressing room and I said, Mel, it was, I don't remember what month, but I said, I want to tell you a joke and I can't think of anybody in the world I'd rather tell this joke to other than you. And he said, why? And I said, well, here's the joke. In early December, a guy in Chicago went into a pet shop and he said, I want to get my wife a pet for a Christmas present, but I want it to be something unusual. And the pet shop owner said, you're very lucky. Just this morning, we got a parakeet in whose name is Chet. And if you warm up his left wing, he sings Joy to the World. And if you warm up his right wing, he sings God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. And the guy says, what do you mean warm up his wing? So he took out a match, lit it, put it by the bird's left wing, went joy to the world, God rest ye merry gentlemen. Oh, he said, I must have that bird. So he bought the bird, ran home, told his wife, I can't wait till Christmas. I got you this pet parakeet named Chet. And if you warm up his left wing, he sings joy to the world, and right wing, God. She said, what do you mean warm it up? He said, joy to the world, God rest ye merry gentlemen. Oh my God, honey, I just put dinner on the table. So she took the parakeet into the living room, put him on the mantle over the fireplace. They sat down to have dinner. Wasn't 30 seconds, and the birds started singing very loudly, Chet's nuts roasting on an open fire. And of course, Mel Torme wrote half that song, wrote the melody, on the Christmas song. I want to tell you some of the practice books that I used and teaching materials, because I'm sure there's a lot that's come out. But, my favorite book, I think, of all time, and I don't think there's any publishing of it, but it was called Gatti, Gatti. It had studies. It had the greatest duets. I loved the duets. They were all very, very musical. And towards the end of my teaching career, young men at that time, Phil Snedeker and Phil Collins, who was in the Cincinnati Symphony, had put out books, lyrical studies. And Phil Collins' book had a lot of operatic arias, which was my favorite form of music. Opera was always my favorite. And I think those methods were just, and what I did with my teaching, I don't know that I learned this from somebody or every trumpet major, and I insisted if they were going to be majoring in trumpet that they do 2 years with me and 2 years with the other trumpet professor. Mark Ponzo, who just retired, was my last colleague, but I had Terry Sawchuk, and there was, during that 28 period, I had some wonderful trumpet teachers. But every one of my majors would have to read a book, a brass book. So for instance, the first semester, they had to read Phil Farkas's The Art of Horn Playing. The second semester, they had to read Irving Bush's book from California. Then the sophomore year, so they ended up with at least 8 books about brass playing to start their library with. Now, there was a book that came out, unfortunately, I don't know, 2 or 3 years after I retired in '97, that I would have made not a book to read one semester, but to read all the time. And it was by a non-professional trumpet player, but one of the nicest and dearest men in my life. You may know him. I met him in Purchase, New York, when we were having the yearly meeting of the International Trumpet Guild in Purchase, New York. And I was having dinner one night at the hotel by myself, and he said, do you mind if I sit down? He introduced himself. He said, my name is Richard Cox, Dr. Richard Cox. And we have become very much like brothers. And he had written a book, which on the back cover, I remember Herseth just absolutely going nuts, saying how wonderful, because there had never really been a book that I knew about that dealt with, at that time, they called it stage fright. He called it performance anxiety. And the name of the book was Managing Your Head and Body So You Can Become a Good Man, a Good Musician. And I think it's still available on Amazon or David Hickman's press. But it was one of those books that I felt answered so many questions for so many people who are fine until they get in front of an audience or in front of a jury, and all of a sudden it just leaves them. And I think Dr. Cox had come up with a tremendous book in that area. And just recently, with the pandemic going on, he's a composer who's written a lot for trumpet and organ. He was a church organist, but plays a lot of trumpet. And one day I was working with him on, he had already finished it, looking for a title. And I said, what about Song of Triumph? And the publishers loved it. And so he sent it out to a couple of major trumpet players who've all written back to him and said how wonderful it is, trumpet and organ. And it's called Song of Triumph. It's a sonata, 3-movement, not big like Kenton or Hindemith or anything like that, but I would recommend that. Now, I want to go back to opera for a minute, because you remember I said when I studied with Joe Ricchino, this old man and his wife, who we called Mama and Papa Ricchino, when we did our 6 weeks with the great conductor Nicola Ricchino, who was the personal conductor of Maria Callas for many of her concerts, and Montserrat Caballé, they would come to Dallas and spend all 6 weeks. And so one day I asked the Maestro Ricchino if it would be okay for Papa Ricchino to come and sit in the pit with me while we were doing Otello. It was just a rehearsal. And he said, fine. The guy sitting behind me, rest his soul, was a trombonist named Artie Lewis. Now there's a passage in Otello where the trumpet, first trumpet, is playing concert A above the staff to E flat on C trumpet. And it's one where you have to triple tongue. And if I sang it slow, it was D, da, 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 da. So every day in the pit, I would be practicing slowly, D, da, 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 you know. And every day I'd look at Artie Lewis, who had the same thing to play. He never practiced it. At the dress rehearsal, I turned around and I said, Artie, I've never heard you once try to play this thing. He said, it's not hard. It's not hard. I said, play it for me. Here's what Artie was playing. D, digga-da, 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 instead of D, digga-da, 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 digga-da. So Papa Ricchino said to me, this is the way, you know, we used to play it at the Met. Anyway, he showed me a new way to play it. It was me, but you had to cheat a little bit. And so when I asked Maestro Ricchino, I said, your father said if you play it, he said, if my father was playing and I was conducting, he wouldn't play it that way. He'd play what Verdi wrote. Speaking about that, when I used to hear all the horror stories about conductors like Reiner and Zell and the tough guys, you know, I was always afraid what would happen if a conductor started to come down on me, because in my heart of hearts, I would know that I was trying 110% to play the best I could. It finally happened with one of the greatest conductors ever, Pierre Montreux, who was 5'4", big walrus mustache, sweet, and never spoke above this level. And it was funny because it never happened before, it never happened since. It was the dress rehearsal of La Mer. And in the last movement, the trumpet has this bum, bum, beam, bum, 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 beam. For some reason, I don't know what happened, but I held the long note 1 count too long. And instead of stopping the orchestra, he let me play the whole solo 1 beat behind the rest of the orchestra. And when we came to the end of the phrase, he stopped and he looked back at me, and this is his exact words. He said, Monsieur, first trumpet, if you promise me you will play the solo that way tomorrow night at the concert, I promise you I will conduct it that way. Otherwise, we should play what Debussy wrote. So, you know, I gave him a salute. Of course, it never happened again, but what a nice way to be told off.
Was this in Dallas?
Yeah, this is in Dallas Symphony. Yeah, of course, Montreux conducted all of those Stravinsky, Firebird, Patricia. He gave the premiere performance of Rite of Spring, and you were looking at history when you played for Pierre Montour.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of history, I want to go back to before we get into the orchestra stuff a little bit more. When you were playing with the Joe Cuba Sextet,
Yeah.
in your autobiography you mentioned, which I should bring up here. This is Ron's really great autobiography with the foreword by Quincy Jones, and you talk about one particular gig you were playing near the Polo Grounds with the Joe Cuba Sextet.
Yes. Oh,
Can you tell that story, please?
It was a jazz place. I just can't bring the name, but it was right by the Polo Grounds. And the gig started at 11 o'clock at night with Horace Silver, featuring Art Farmer, Hank Mobley, and the other two guys who I can't remember. Then at 12 o'clock midnight, Joe Cuba's octet with me and another guy. And at 1 o'clock, the Dizzy Gillespie Big Band with James Moody, Lee Morgan, Charlie Persip on drums, Frank Rehack on trombone. It was all the great players of Dizzy's time. And I'll never forget getting in there, the Rockland Palace. That was the name of it, the Rockland Palace. There was 2,000 Black people and me. So I went up to my Puerto Rican brothers in Joe Cuba's sextet, a great drummer named Jimmy Sabatel. And I said, Jimmy, stick close to me because I'm very frightened here. He said, hey man, they hate us more than they hate you. I'm gonna hide behind you. it was just one of the, but it never turned out to be anything like that. They were great audiences and we had a fantastic time. My father dropped me off. My father used to drive a taxi in New York for most of his life at night in Times Square. And on that night, he took me to the Rockland Palace and dropped me off. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I got a cab and came home safely.
Did you know Dizzy at that point already, or did you meet him on that gig?
I did not. I did not meet Dizzy until 1977. And he came out to do 4 days with the NIU Jazz Ensemble. And
how about Lee Morgan or Art Farmer? Did you wind up talking to those guys?
No, I didn't meet them. Art Farmer was one of my absolute favorite flugelhorn players of all time. And Lee Morgan had to be one of the great jazz up and coming players, only to be ended. His life was ended by being shot at 110th and 5th Avenue. I forget the name of that place, but a woman.
Slugs, ironically, was the name of the place he got shot.
Yeah, 110th Street and 5th Avenue. We played there one time, and they told me that this was the spot where Lee Morgan, a woman who he had been seeing, came up and shot him and killed him that night.
Yeah, tragic.
It was a tough time.
Well, and then not long after that, you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, but we were talking about your auditions for Ormandy, Zell, and Stokowski. So
yeah.
Told us a bit
within
about
within a 6-week period.
What were those? I think you told us about the Stokowski one, but talk about Ormandy and Zell a little bit.
Well, Zell, my Uncle Louis was still principal trumpet in the orchestra. This was 1953. And he called my mother the night before the audition, and he said to my mother, there is no way, no matter how well I play, that Zell would hire me. He said, I'm only having him play for Zell because I want Zell to tell me what he thinks about his future. And the opening, have you ever heard of this opening? Third, assistant, second.
Yes.
That was the opening.
Yeah, yes.
Third, assistant, second. So I get there, and for the only one of those auditions, I guess because it was my Uncle Louis' conductor, he starts with the prelude of Parsifal, okay? I'm on my B-flat trumpet, of course, right? Which is complete suicide. I started playing, and all I did was make an 16th note. I did it the other way. I doubled up the time. Zell jumped out of his seat, ran up to the piano and started pounding on the piano 16th notes, saying, no, my boy, it's, the da, da, da. Instead of da, 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 I went da, da, da. And just, so I started playing again. And he says to me, not so much vibrato. I said, Maestro, that's not vibrato. I'm shaking. I'm very nervous. He said, go out and take a drink of water. So I went out and took a drink of water. And after that, I came in, I was fine. And he ran me through the Bartok Concerto for Orchestra. And he ended up with exactly the same advice that Ormandy, he told my Uncle Louis, very gifted, needs to learn the repertoire 3 to 5 years in a small orchestra, you know.
Yeah.
The one with Stokowski was absolutely one of the funniest two things in my book. Stokowski was going through a nasty, nasty divorce with Gloria Vanderbilt, one of the Millionaire Women. And that day I was playing in Boston that whole summer. And isn't it funny that that week my father picked up Stokowski in his cab, and Stokowski remembered my father from having talked about my Uncle Louis. So he said, tell your son to come Friday to my place in Central Park. He owned a big apartment in Central Park. He owned the building. So I flew from Boston that morning into New York, went to his place, got in an elevator that opened up right into his apartment. And he's there with his silk robe, the brocade and the ascot and the whole, and his hair sticking way up in the air. I remember he's going through this terrible divorce. So I played the audition for him, and now he sits down at his desk, and this is the exact conversation. And he never looks up, never looks back. He just says, what is your current address? I told him. He said, what is your current phone number? And I told him. He said, you are married? I said, no, Maestro, but I'm getting married Monday. You're in for a lot of trouble. And he kept writing. He never looked up. They just kept writing. And it was just, he gave one of the best auditions that I've ever taken, because all he had was a piece of musical staff paper, maybe 8 by 10. It had 12 excerpts on it. It didn't tell you what key, it didn't tell you what dynamic, it didn't tell you what tempo. All it had were notes. And he would just say, play. So like the first one I recognized immediately was the last movement of Tchaikovsky Fifth. The next one was from Scheherazade, the next one was from Don Juan. And I went through all 12. It was all standard repertoire, you know, but just incredible, you know, that, you know, what can you say? Those were a totally different types of conductors than we have today. And the rules are different.
You know, I asked your friend Bernie Edelstein one time who were his favorite conductors to play under, and he said the dead ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think he was making the same point you were, because of you know, the way those guys were. I'm curious. You played your whole career on B-flat trumpet. Did you ever think about switching to C trumpet for most of the
Well, when I joined Tulsa Philharmonic, that was my first orchestra. And my Uncle Louis, I'm saying this because I don't know whether things have changed, but my Uncle Louis said that 3 things I want you to do for me. Number 1, I want you to come to rehearsals and concerts at least a half an hour early, at least a half an hour early. Secondly, when you come to rehearsal, I want you to be dressed nicely. And third, and very important, if the conductor says 1 and 1 is 3, it is 3. Otherwise, you're not going to be there next year. And it was, you know, if I take away anything from 15 years of playing principal trumpet, it's that no conductor in 15 years of opera and symphony, not one conductor ever changed anything that I ever played musically. Now, one year we had an associate conductor from the Chicago Symphony named Erwin Hoffman, who came out, and we were doing Leonora 3, and, you know, off stage, and he made me play it 7 different ways and ended up taking it the first way I played it, which was the norm, you know. Now, here's an interesting thing. When I played for Schulte the second year in Dallas, and he did Leonora 3, I did the usual accelerando and tenuto at the end, you know, and so I came up to he called me up to the podium at the first intermission, and he said, do you know what this bugle call comes in the opera, Fidelio? And do you know what it's signaling? I said, no, I really didn't know. He said, it's a bugler, an army bugler sounding the war starting, right? He said, how many army buglers do you know that make it cellerandos and tenutos? That was a very good question. I played later on in the season, I played Rienzi with him. And I did like my uncles had taught me, you start as soft as you can, you bring up a big crescendo to double F, then you go back to double P. And so I did it that way. And again, Schulte called me up and he said, why are you making so much of this? I said, what do you mean? He said, you don't have to make all this, which made the solo so much easier, I got to tell you my favorite story in my book, the best story and there are so many stories about so many different artists. But there was one night I drove from DeKalb, Illinois to Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, which is a suburb of Milwaukee, to pick up Maynard Ferguson, the great Maynard Ferguson. And we drove back and got into DeKalb at 3 a.m. We went and had pancakes and coffee. And I put him in his room at the student center, which was beautiful rooms, at 4 a.m. Now, believe it or not, 4 hours later, I'm sitting having breakfast with him, and I'm doing an interview for my Uncle Louis Davidson's book called Trumpet Profiles. You have a copy, right?
Yeah, this is it right here, this book.
Yeah, Trumpet Profiles, which was a fantastic book that my Uncle Louis had written with 33 of the greatest trumpet players giving their practice regimen, all their musical favorites, great book, great. I understand there's a new one out now because that one was written in the 60s or 70s. It's still selling. After 60 years, it's still selling, the Trumpet Profiles and his original one, Trumpet Techniques. And there's a man named Quinlan in Canada, puts them out on a Q Press. Anyway, I picked him up at 8 o'clock in the morning. We're sitting in the student union having a breakfast, and I'm interviewing Maynard Ferguson. So when you read it in that book, that's my printing of his answers. So now at 10 o'clock, I take him for his first clinic with our second jazz band. We finish at 10 minutes to 11. His next thing is not till noon. So I said to Maynard, would you like to go back to your room and grab a quick nap? Or our brass faculty quintet is going to rehearse a marvelous piece by Ingolf Dahl. And he said, no, I'd rather go to the rehearsal with you. So we go to the music school and we're set up in our little recital hall. And so I'm sitting here and Maynard's right here on my right. And we're doing this great piece by Ingolf Dahl. And on the first page, there's a concert D, on fourth space D, E for B flat trumpet. And you have to hold it out for 12 counts, I think it was. And the dynamic was PP. And I pride myself in all those years of having developed, I could go 3 or 4 pianissimos. I really had that control without losing any of the quality of sound. So I'm sitting there and I'm holding this note, 3 or 4 Ps, and with no warning whatsoever, Maynard Ferguson leads over in my right ear and says, why don't you go fuck yourself? That was the end of rehearsal. There was nobody could do anything because here's the greatest high note player, best player. Herseth called him the greatest brass player ever, and Maynard called Herseth the greatest brass player ever. But saying that at the time he said it, absolutely, it's like, I won't tell you the guy's name, but we had a guy in the Dallas Symphony trumpet section. Now remember, this is back in the 60s. If anybody said the word or implied the word queer, this guy would go nuts. He's in the trumpet set and he would say, don't talk about that. I don't want to talk about it. No to him. So one day, it's the only time in my 9 years in that orchestra that I pulled a prank, and I just couldn't help it. Every September, we would play outdoors at the Cotton Bowl for Texas when Texas played Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. So we had 30,000 people in front of us, and behind us were all the fireworks that would follow the last piece, which was the 1812 Overture, and they had 18 real cannons from the Army base nearby. So here we are, we're playing the rehearsal in the afternoon, and we get to that little spot in the 1812 Overture where the first trumpet has this little solo. The horns go, and the first trumpet goes, then there's 4 bars more. So we get to that place, and I play, and I look at this guy and I said, I found out we have a queer in the trumpet section. And then I played the next song. He leans over and he says, who is it? I kissed him right on his cheek. He wanted to kill me. He wanted to kill me. He didn't talk to me for about 3 weeks. I just couldn't help it. You know, sometimes you just do something.
Exactly. Well, talk about that a little bit. I knew you were in Tulsa for a few years. You were learning the repertoire there.
6 years, yeah.
6 years. And I know you had a lot of great experiences there. Can you talk about hearing UC Bjorling live?
Well, Tulsa had 2 operas performed every year, the Tulsa Civic Opera. And they were great. I mean, they brought in wonderful people. And at the very end of my last year in Tulsa was so wonderful to have the great UC Bjorling come along with one of the greatest baritones ever at the Metropolitan Opera named Leonard Warren. And it was to be the premiere, the debut performance of a soprano named Anna Ross in the production of Il Trovatore of Verdi. And, you know, Okies are Okies. So when I say that, it's with the love in my heart, because Tulsa was the greatest city I ever lived in. The best people, the cleanest city. When I lived there, 1953 to 1960, it was sensational. But Okies are Okies. So when I first got there, being brought up in the Bronx, if I'd go to a filling station and say, hey, fill it up, will you? I'd get this. You're from New York, ain't you? You know, it's so my minor in college was speech dialect. So I could pick that up. And from then on, I would always talk with my Okie twang, you know. And one of the funny stories about Tulsa Philharmonic was we had this wonderful conductor, Vladimir Goldschman, who was in St. Louis for some 27 years and then moved over to Tulsa. And he was the sweetest man. I remember having him up to dinner at my apartment. Anyway, we were doing Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto, the B flat, the famous one. And where Goldschman had been sweet, never a crossword. The soloist was the great Artur Rubinstein, one of the greatest pianists ever. And evidently he was Goldschman's best friend. So Goldschman wanted to give him the best accompaniment possible. And he was nervous the whole week, particularly about the last 32 bars of the piece, which gets a little complicated, you know, with the orchestra. So anyway, we have the one dress rehearsal. We make it through perfect. And this timpani player named Chuck, oh God, I can't think of his last name, holds his hand up to Goldschman and he says, Maestro, 8 bars from the end, am I supposed to be mezzo forte or forte? And for the first time, I find out that Goldschman is Jewish. Because in Yiddish, he said, that should be my eigene Zurus. He said, that should be my only worry is whether you have mezzo forte or forte, which just, you know, 80% of the orchestra was Okie. 20% was a guy like me that was brought in for a principal position. Then the most hysterical story that ever happened in my 6 years there was we were supposed to have a conductor from New Orleans named Cellini come and conduct a masked ball of Verdi, Un Balla Maschera. The first night of rehearsal, everybody in the orchestra could tell that Cellini wanted to be any place but Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was just sort of with a pencil going through it. The next morning, in the front page of the Tulsa Daily World, the headline says, Cellini leaves, says orchestra not capable. Well, that was the biggest lie because we had already done Bohème and Aida and Carmen and all the repertoire. What we found out later was that at a very late date, RCA had offered him a chance to record a full opera with a big cast. So instead of calling the Tulsa Opera and asking out, he chose to use this story, see? So now they're in a panic. We only have 1 week left. So they bring in a conductor from New York whose name is Carlo Moresco. And at the first rehearsal, and this guy's really intense, he's conducting along and all of a sudden he goes, fagotti, mezzo forte. So I looked over to the bassoons and I said, not so loud. Then later on he said, corno, un tutto forza. So at intermission, he calls me up. He speaks no English. He speaks no English. He says, prima tromba, capisci italiano? Do you understand Italian? I said, un poco, a little, maestro. So he makes me understand that if I will interpret for him the whole week, he'll have the contract to put $50 extra on my check, okay? This is 1959. So we're going along doing a masked ball, and when we get to this one spot, every single rehearsal, Moresco looks at the trombones and says, trombone, basta, basta, enough, enough. Well, now we're down to the wire at the dress rehearsal. You try to picture this. There are 2 brothers playing first and second trombone, Bill and Frank McPeters. And they get to that spot, they're loud as hell, and Moresco goes off on a minute and a half tangent, saying every curse word that I ever heard in Italian and ending by saying, prima donna mi cogliones, you're the prima donna of my testicles. So there's complete silence. And the second trombone, Bill Peters, taps me with his trombone slide and he says, if he said what I think he said, I'm gonna bust him in the mouth. What'd he say? So I said, too loud? He said, that's all he said with all them fancy words? I said, well, it was a fancy way of saying it. Yeah, but that's, so I avoided this conflict. We played, the opera. I left after that year, and the next year, Moresco actually had a fist fight with the principal bass player during an opera in intermission. They take the Italian people who were into opera. It was like when I was associate marching band director at Southern Methodist University. Texas football is, in Texas, it's football God country in that order. Football God country. In Italian, it's opera God country. So, don't mess around with the, they were very serious about the opera is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to be called that. So, so after Tulsa, then you went to Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
And let's talk a little bit about your 3 music directors there and anything you want to say about that.
Well, the first year, I played auditions like everybody else to get into an orchestra. And in 1957, Dallas brought from Switzerland a conductor named Paul Kletsky. And I auditioned for the principal trumpet spot in Philadelphia, where he was guest conducting, before anybody else. And he, believe it or not, 1 hour and 40 minutes. That's how long the audition, and it was only 3 pieces. I remember La Mer and pictures and something else. And he kept asking me, you really want to play principal in Dallas? I said, yes, maestro, very much. I fell in love with him. I just loved him. And I kept waiting month after month after month. Frank Kederevic had called me to let me know he was leaving to go to Chicago. So I was the first one to, and the way he talked, I knew I had the job. Without him knowing it, without Kletzky knowing it, Donald Johannes, who was the assistant conductor to Kletzky, had such pressure brought to bear on him by the music critic of the Dallas Morning News named John Rosenfield. This is what I was told, of course, to hire a very gifted trumpet player from a little town called Seagoville named Boyd Hood. And of course, Boyd Hood turned out to be great, years in the LA Philharmonic. So he got the job and I went to Tulsa. Now, 2 years later, Dallas came through Tulsa. And after the concert, I went backstage to say hello to the maestro. And they said the maestro had an attack of the gout. He went back to the hotel. And here's Boyd Hood. And I went up and I introduced myself. And Boyd and I stayed out all night till 3 or 4 in the morning. We went to a party. He was great. I had no idea, none at all, that the next morning when he stepped on the bus, they gave him his papers that he was done. I had no idea. And I was shocked. And the next day, I got a call from the manager of the Dallas Symphony saying, when can you come and audition? Maestro Kletzky would like to have you come. So I go to the Dallas big hall, 4,000 seat hall where we used to play concerts downtown. And I'm in the back room where the ballet dancers all have the mirrors and the poles. So I'm staying, and there's 8 principal players in front of me. There's no screen or anything. And Maestro Kletzky says, play. I played the 2 Leonora calls. I played the opening of La Coque d'Or. I played the melodic solo from Don Juan. I played the melodic solo from Don Quixote. I played Zarathustra. I played Petrushka. I played Pictures. I played about 12 things. And Kletzky kind of shook his shoulders, like, so he took out the Infernal Dance from the Firebird Suite, and I ripped right through that. And he took out something else, I ripped through that. Now, he takes out the Bruckner 7th Symphony, goes to the Scherzo movement, which is in F trumpet, 1 to a bar, 3/4 time, and it's got flats all throughout the whole thing. And I'm with my B flat trumpet. And I stepped all over myself. I just, really screwed up. And Kletzky looked at me and said, how long would it take you to learn this? And I said, probably a day or two, woodshedding, taking care of business. And the next thing I know, I'm the first trumpet of the Dallas Symphony in the next season.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was, playing with Kletzky was the greatest between Kletzky and Schulte, and 2 completely, absolutely opposite styles of conducting rehearsals. Kletzky would start on Tuesday, Wednesday, we had 2 rehearsals, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. We used to have 6 rehearsals for a concert, 6 or 7 rehearsals. Yeah, 2.5-hour rehearsals, not like today.
Yeah.
By the 7th or 6th rehearsal, we knew on Monday, concerts were on Monday night, we knew we were going to have overtime on Monday. We had the dress rehearsal, and we always had overtime. So I'm in my first season, and we had been doing on this particular concert, the Dance of Vengeance by Samuel Barber from Medea. And there's a spot in that piece where all of a sudden there's a bar in 3/8, no, it's 3/4 and 5/8, 3/4 and 5/8, or 5/8 and 3/4, whatever it was. But Kletzky could not make up his mind during the week of rehearsal. Did he want to do the 5/8 bar in 5, or did he want to do the 3/4 and 6? Or, So at the end of the dress rehearsal, we had just run it through, and there was still an uneasiness in that 2 bars. So Kletzky looked at the orchestra. He said, anybody have any questions? And very meekly, my hand went up, way in the back. And yes, first trumpet, what? I said, Maestro, when we get to that 5/8, 3/4, are you going to be in 3 and 6 or what? And he made up his mind right there. He said, I'll be in 3 and 5. And that night it came off perfect. But right after I asked him, you know what he said? I said to him, are you good? He said, I knew I shouldn't have hired you. He was kidding, but because he knew I caught him, in the fact that he wasn't being definitive.
Right.
But then he knew. I have pictures of him at the airport leaving on our first tour in January, holding my firstborn son, Scott. And he was such a sweet man. He knew everybody's wife. He knew the children. Now, here's Schulte. Schulte had the greatest rehearsal technique I ever saw. Schulte would come in. First concert we played with Schulte was Egmont Overture, Petrushka, and Brahms First. Second concert was Bartók's Miraculous Mandarin, Tilleulenspiegel, and La Mer. Third concert was Janáček's Sinfonietta for 14 trumpets. The fourth concert was the Bach Third Suite, followed by the Symphonic Metamorphosis of Hindemann. I mean, in the first 5 concerts, by then we were doing Sunday afternoon and Monday night. In the first 10 concerts, he gave me 6 solo bows, okay? So now he's leaving at the end of the 5th week to go up to New York to do the New York Philharmonic for 2 weeks. So I walk into his dressing room at the end of the last rehearsal before he's leaving, and I give him a picture of himself. And I said, Maestro, would you autograph this for me? Swear to God, without looking up, he said, what's your name? When he addressed people in the orchestra, it was second trumpet, first flute, third horn. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, to conclude this story, I get a letter from a former colleague of mine from the Tulsa Philharmonic who played bass clarinet named Wolf Adler, who came from the same town in Hungary that Schulte did. And he said, during an intermission of the New York Philharmonic, he went up on stage and they were reminiscing about Hungary. And Schulte didn't realize that the orchestra had come back and was seated waiting to start. And Wolf Adler said to Schulte, one of my old colleagues from Tulsa is in your orchestra in Dallas. And Schulte said, which one? He said, first trumpet. He said, Ronald Modell, excellent. So they try to play around with your head once in a while, but Schulte was magnificent.
And then you had Johannes after that, right?
Johannes had a great repertoire, but like every other conductor, there were certain things that you have to stay away from. You know what I'm saying? Yes. There were certain things that Toscanini should have never conducted. There were certain things that Zell should have never conducted. It just wasn't in their basket. It wasn't in their bailiwick, Yeah. But he was a nice guy, and he really was very nice to me. Yeah. And we had a good time.
And then after, so you were what year did you leave? Well, let's talk about you're going to Northern Illinois, because that's a major detour out of the orchestra.
Well, I was in the Dallas Symphony the entire 60 to 69.
Right.
I left in 69 and joined the faculty in September of 69 at Northern Illinois University. And my contract read associate professor of trumpet, classical trumpet, and director of the Northern Illinois University Jazz Ensemble. Now, at Northern Illinois, they had never had a note of jazz played on their campus, ever. Phi Mu Alpha, which was the music fraternity, once a year would play some stock orchestrations, once a year at a dance sort of thing, but they never, at least that's what I was told. So I actually, it was like having a baby. I came in and started something absolutely and saw it grow into one of the most incredible groups ever. And I say that with great respect to North Texas State and Illinois and all the great schools that had great jazz programs. In fact, I had a big argument with the producer of an hour PBS special, which he was played in 1983 across the country, called A Year in the Life of the World's Greatest College Jazz Band. I said, you can't say that. There's like 20 bands I could tell you that are just phenomenal programs. And so I finally, because Dizzy Gillespie was doing the voiceover in the beginning, I finally got him to change it to say one of the, he said, and now let's take a look at, I had him change one word. Let me try to remember. One of the greatest. That's what I told him to say. And he kind of fumbled a little bit before he said it. Let's listen to one of the greatest. Because when I asked the producer, he said, nobody wants to hear second. They only want to hear first. And I said, I couldn't let him get away with that.
Yeah.
I mean, what a disrespect to the great programs in our country. And we were very proud of our program. We were absolutely fantastic. Every jazz player that ever came and played with the NIU Jazz Ensemble, they had a ball. It was just a great atmosphere.
Well, one of the things that's amazing about what you did there was the people you brought in. I mean, it's a hall of fame. And I wanted to kind of just bring some names up. I mean, you already mentioned Maynard Ferguson. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was Duke Ellington, because that was right at the end of Duke's life. And that's.
Well, he played his very last concert in what was then called the Student Ballroom, Holmes Center Ballroom. And he had been very sick with cancer. And here we came that night for the concert. And I was sitting in the president's box in the balcony. And his son, Mercer, came out to the box and said, Dad would like to say hi. He and I had worked together when I was with the Dallas Symphony. He came and guest conducted one night, and we did a lot of Duke's music that he wrote for orchestra. And when I walked into his hotel room, he was slumped over on the bed. He was sitting, but slumped over. He was so cancer ridden. And he insisted on standing up, and we hugged each other. And I had a shirt made for him that said on the front, "We love you madly," which was his favorite expression to say to an audience. And it said NIU Jazz Ensemble on the back. But unfortunately, he held it to the side that said NIU Jazz Ensemble. But it wasn't 2 months later, or 3 months later, he died. But that was his last night. He tried to go on stage the next night in Kalamazoo and had to be taken off after 10 minutes. Wow. So they renamed the ballroom the Duke Ellington Ballroom.
Amazing.
But I made him laugh that night because I said, when you conducted the Dallas Symphony, in my whole career of symphony playing, I never had a conductor who started the orchestra by going, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You know, and he laughed, you know. He was the most elegant man that I ever met in my life, the most elegant.
Wow. Wow.
And Clark Terry was like absolutely the prince of princes. He was a magnificent player. And even the greatest player that I ever heard in my career, now this is me personally, but the greatest musician, and when I say that, for me, it means that this person did things in the music that I never dreamed of, nor did anybody else. And that was the great Russian trumpeter, Timofey Dokshitzer. And even Dokshitzer, when he was writing me, and we wrote for 30 years, 35 years, we wrote each other. And he always stayed in contact with the one he called his Christopher Columbus, was my Uncle Louis Davidson. He called my Uncle Louis his Christopher, because Louis introduced Dokshitzer to the United States audiences. Nobody had ever heard of him. And my Uncle Louis and then the former principal horn of the Boston Symphony, Jimmy Stagliano, put their money together and produced an album of Timofey Dokshitzer with tapes that were secretly sent out of Russia and featured a lot of Fritz Kreisler pieces.
Ron, should I show that album while we're talking about it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
That's the original.
That was the very first one. And his name is spelt now Dokshitzer. And his family in New York have even shortened it to Dok. So anyway.
Well, while you're on the subject, we could come back to the jazz guys in a little bit, but since you brought up Dokshitzer, let's talk a little bit about how that happened with your Uncle Louis and Timofey, and how that started.
Well, I woke up one morning in Dallas in 65, in March of 65, I think it was, and the phone rang, and it was my Uncle Louis, and he said, this is the exact words, he said, Ronnie, I heard God play the trumpet this morning. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Timofey had been traveling as principal trumpet with a Russian orchestra whose principal trumpet had gotten sick at the last minute, and Timofey stepped in. And as was my Uncle Louis' MO, whenever there was a visiting orchestra with trumpets, he would always invite them to his house for drinks and food and everything. And so they came back. Now, Dokshitzer didn't speak any English and Louis didn't speak any Russian. But the fact that my Uncle Louis was proficient in Yiddish, and Yiddish being so close to German, they were able to talk to each other all the time. And after a while, my Uncle Louis took out some recordings that he had done with the Cleveland Orchestra. And at that time, 1 or 2 in the morning, Timofey took out his trumpet and played some of these things that are on that album. And it was like, lock the door, you know, this guy. And I truly believe after all these years, I've never heard anybody make music like Timofey. He seemed to find things in the music that nobody ever dreamed of and could execute without ever thinking twice. It didn't matter how high it was. It didn't matter how soft it was. It's just getting a musical thought. Like when I was a kid playing out of the Arbin book, just like you play all those little things in the back of the Arbin book. One day sitting in the pit in the Dallas Civic Orchestra, Dallas Orchestra, Civic Opera Orchestra, Lyric Orchestra. I hear this piece and the soprano singing it. And I said, where do I know that from? Where do I know that from? It was from the back of the Arbin book, but she was singing it in a musical way that I never dreamed. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's the great part of music. In all the hundreds of clinics that I did during my career, I always told this story about you could take 5 principal players from any major orchestra, first flute, first clarinet, first oboe, first bassoon, first horn, put them in 5 separate rooms, give each of them the same piece of music that none of them have ever seen in their life, and have them play it for you. And you may have 5 different interpretations. Most likely you wouldn't. But if there was a different interpretation, who would have the nerve to say, that's not right? So you have this wonderful opportunity when you're playing to be able to play it as you feel it, as you think it should be played.
Now, Ron, I feel like you've told me before a little bit about, because you were in touch with Timofey. I mean, we talked about this earlier. I remember the first time I saw you was at Louis Davidson's funeral.
Right.
I was a student at Indiana and actually played there. And when you read a letter from Timofey, I got kind of nervous because I had to play the shofar at the end of the thing.
Yeah.
But if I recall right, we've had a conversation where you talked about how Timofey would often stop the cab a few blocks away from the hotel, so the miners, KGB wouldn't follow.
Yeah. He was followed all the time, and he never wanted to get Louis in trouble. In fact, the guy that used to interpret all the letters that they would send each other at Indiana University was a guy named Larry Richter in the language department. And Larry said when he was in Moscow one time to visit, Timofey said, call me at this exact time. So he called him right at that exact time. And Timofey seemed very angry and upset and said, why did you call me now? Why didn't you call me when I told you to call? And he actually called at the time. He said, all right, I'll come by and pick you up. The reason he did that was so that Timofey could be in his own car, which was not bugged. So he could have a little private time with Larry Richter.
Amazing. And Larry Richter is Andy Richter's father off the Conan.
That's right, of Conan O'Brien. Yep, right.
Wow.
And he was a wonderful guy, by the way. Larry's son, and Larry was a terrific guy.
And you played for Timofey at one point, right?
I played for him at the International Trumpet Guild when it was in Wisconsin. And we had never met face to face, but we had been writing for years. And I used to send him music and tapes, and I sent it via Rostropovich, the great cellist. My last concert of my career with Dallas, I went into his dressing room. He was the soloist, and I said, Maestro, do you know my friend Timofey Dokshitzer? And in this great big Russian voice, he said, when I conduct Bolshoi, no Timofey, no conduct, because they had 2 principal trumpets, and he wouldn't play unless it was Timofey's orchestra. So I gave him huge amounts of recordings, CDs, cassettes, and all the music until finally Timofey said, you can't do this anymore. I just can't, you know. And you know that Schilke, on that first day when Louis heard, he called Schilke, and Schilke immediately made him a C trumpet and sent it to Russia, to Timofey as a gift, and Timofey never got it. It was interrupted somewhere along the line.
I believe
But
he sent another one later, though, if I'm correct on that. He sent a second one, I think. That
yes, oh yes.
Yeah.
But one time when Timofey was on tour, the longest period of time was 1978 or 77. He had 15 days. And of course, he could never bring Mona with him, his wife or his son. And 3 of those days were at Vince Chikowitz's school, Northwestern. At the last second, just as Timofey arrived, Vince had an ulcer attack. And he called me and said, can you come and stay with him and take him around? And I said, absolutely, absolutely. So every night before we went to dinner, Timofey would look at me and he'd say, spazieren. He said, we have to take a brisk walk before we go to dinner, so we have a good meal. So one night we were out walking near Lake Michigan in Evanston, and he saw for the first time in his life a watering thing that was watering somebody's lawn that goes this way and that way. And then he had never seen one in his life. He said, oh, how I would love to have that for my summer home. So Joan Schilke, Schilke's daughter, and I finally found a bassoon case that we could put one of those in, and we shipped it to him. And the day I was driving him to Bloomington, it was so funny because he knew 2 or 3 words in English. But we went by on Lakeshore Drive, we went by a big building that had 2 rabbit ears on it. And Timofey looked at me and said, Playboy. How national that is.
We all have our priorities.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, let's get back to I want to get back to the jazz guys from Northern Illinois, and then there's a litany of people I want to go through because you play with everybody. Can you talk a little bit about Dizzy Gillespie coming to Northern Illinois?
Well, Dizzy came on the bus. I learned the first night, and our dear bus driver, Wilbur Rand, rest him, who was best man at Kathy and I's wedding, along with my son, Scott. I had to tell Wilbur, when I announced to the band that the bus was leaving at 10, I had to get Wilbur to get Dizzy up at 9, because Dizzy was always an hour late. But he carried with him that year a thing called La Machine. So when he got to his hotel room, he'd buy all kinds of fresh vegetables and stuff and make soup. And he'd keep his hotel room door open, and whoever walked by, he'd invite in to have a cup of soup. He was unbelievable. He gave the greatest clinics. Whenever we did a clinic with him, he made a beeline when we got to the school to go immediately to the drummer in the band. And he said, I don't care what you do, as long as I know where 1 is. He was a great clinician. And of course, you know what a great player he was. But he was a prince. He was a real prince.
Yeah. What about Stan Kenton?
Well, Stan Kenton came and clinicked. And, you know, where would we be today in the world of jazz if we didn't have Stan Kenton? Yeah. He was the guy like Leon Breeden at North Texas State that fought the battles to make jazz legitimate. Right. You know, they were the best in the world.
But Tito Puente.
Tito Puente was in Spanish, mi hermano. He was my brother. I saw him when I was playing with Joe Cuba. Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, and Machito would each do 4 days a week at the Palladium in New York. And he was like, they called him El Rey, which means the king. And of course, his upbringing was when he played with Machito. Because Machito, one night when I was playing with Machito in 1958, they decided to have a battle of the bands. So Tito Rodriguez played the first set, Tito Puente played the second set, and then Machito played. And when it was over, Tito Puente walked up to the real leader of the Machito band, great musician, great leader named Mario Bauza. And he took Mario Bauza's hand and he said, you win, Papa. You know, I mean, there were certain nights, just like with Duke Ellington's band, there were some nights that Duke Ellington's band sounded like a high school band, a bad high school band. I mean, those guys were known for drinking and other things, but don't ever challenge them. Don't challenge them. Now, do you remember an actor, singer, dancer named Gregory Hines?
Of course, absolutely.
Gregory Hines,
yep.
who I met when he was 10 years old. He and his brother Maurice, I had them to my house. I played their act. It was called the Hines Kids. And as they grew up, it became Hines and Brown with Johnny Brown. Anyway, their dad, whose name was Chink Brown, was 6'4", 240, and played drums with Lionel Hampton. And one night at the famous Savoy Ballroom, where you had two bands, one would start, play a half-hour set, then the next band play a half hour, then they come back. Hampton got up before the band and said to them, "Let's show the Duke how it really goes. Let's beat his ass down tonight." And Chink Hines sitting at the drum saying, "Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't get the Duke mad. Don't get the Duke mad." So Hamp went out there and got the Duke mad. Ellington's band came out, played their first set, and Hampton packed up his vibes and his stuff and left. There was no more Hampton band that night. So Chink Hines, who I love dearly, Chink was a wonderful man. I don't know whether he's alive. He lived in Vegas, but I knew that Hines kids, even when they were younger and as they grew up.
Incredible. Claudio Roditi.
Oh, now you're talking about sweetness and gentleness, and what an incredible talent. Claudio was, he was the salt of the earth. He and Paquito de Rivera came to play with me and Tito Puente, and Tito Puente's wonderful musical director, Madera, Bob, Johnny Rodriguez, and Jose Madera, whose father was in Machito's band when I was in Machito's band, Pin Madera. He was simply amazing. That's the only thing I can tell you, but he's absolutely the greatest performer before an audience that you could ever want to play with.
Yeah. About John Faddis.
Well, Faddis, I forget the year he came to New York from San Francisco, but at 1 o'clock in the morning, I got a call. It was probably in the 70s. 1 o'clock in the morning, Lou Solov says, "Ronnie, listen to this guy. John, play for Ronnie." And here's John Faddis screaming. He said, "His name is John Faddis. He just came from San Francisco. I wanted you to hear him play." I said, "Great, Lou. I look forward to meeting him." But John Faddis, all the guys in the Thad Jones, Mel Lewis band, they had to hate John Faddis because it was a hard enough band to play their charts the way they were written. But then John joined the band and played everything an octave up, and the writing went, gablooey. But how could you get a more exciting? And John Faddis did a clinic one day where he imitated 5 or 10 of the greatest trumpet players. You would have sworn you were there with Rex Stewart or Roy Eldridge, he was just marvelous. But John had a way about him that didn't always make him appreciated or liked, because he had a certain way of acting, and I think he kind of came out of it. I did a tour with him one time with he and James Moody and Slide Hampton, all three of them together.
Amazing.
And he was wonderful. He was wonderful. Got home, and 3 days later, I got a note that just had 4 words. The kids always call me Mode, and the note said, "I love you, Mode." And it was signed John. That was it, which was a great compliment because John didn't do things like that.
It's very sweet. There's a great story in your book about Vinnie DiMartino coming to do a clinic, and your father concert.
I got to tell you, first and foremost, I've said this ever since I met and heard Vinnie DiMartino. Vinnie is the greatest all-around trumpet player that I've heard in my whole career. Vinnie can do anything and do it absolutely superb. Symphony, jazz, lead, anything, the Jack Daniels band, you know. Anyway, my father, rest him, was in the president's box the night we played at NIU. And I told Vinnie that my father was visiting from New Jersey. I was so delighted that he was here to hear you. So I say to the audience now, ladies and gentlemen, Vinnie would like to dedicate to my dad the next song entitled Blues for Cootie.
Concerto for Cootie.
What was it?
Concerto for Cootie, right?
Yeah, Concerto for Cootie. So I lift my hands up to give a downbeat, and under his breath, Vinnie says, I didn't know your father's name was Cootie. And I just cracked up. I mean, I totally lost it. For about 30 seconds, I could not, you know, he got me. What can I say? He really got me. But the sweetest, and has a son named Gabriel, that I heard when he was 3 years old at the Hilton Hotel during the Midwest Band Clinic. My beautiful wife, Kathy, and I went up to Vinnie's room, and Vinnie said to Gabriel, 3 years old, I want you to play the Haydn Concerto, some of the Haydn Concerto from Mr. and Mrs. Modell. And this little 3-year-old boy went into the closet so that he could make an entrance, came out with a little E-flat trumpet and went bum, 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 then took a bow. He's 3 years old.
It's amazing. Let's talk about Quincy Jones.
Well, Quincy is, you know, an icon of incredible stature. The way it happened with Quincy and I was that the Montreux Jazz Festival was going to do a 50-year retrospective of Quincy Jones' music, including all of his films and TV shows and movies and stuff. And they thought that they had engaged the #1 big band in Europe, which is called the WDR Band of Cologne. And about a month, little over a month, it turned out that half that band had contracted themselves to tour with Phil Collins. So they had no band. As fate would have it, and we talked about this a little earlier, being at the right place at the right time, we were going to play at the Montreux Jazz Festival that year. Claude Naves, who was the head of the Montreux Jazz Festival, had made a rule that no college or university band would ever be permitted to play in the main auditorium, which was called Stravinsky Hall. They had to play in the Miles Davis Theater. Well, the same day that Claude Naves found out that he didn't have a band, and he had already hired Phil Collins for those one night, and he had Phil Collins, Patty Austin, Shaka Khan, David Sanborn, Jim Morrison, incredible soloists. He got a fax from Leon Breeden, who was the first jazz band in 1970 to ever play at the Montreux Jazz Festival, and who was the most respected jazz program in the country. They were then called North Texas State University. And Leon Breeden wrote to Claude Naves and said, I understand that the NIU Jazz Ensemble is coming to play this summer at the Montreux Jazz Festival. In having heard 500 bands in my life, this band deserves to play in Stravinsky Hall. Well, there he was with this fax. So he took that fax and sent it to Quincy Jones with a note saying, we don't have the WDR band. What do you think about using the NIU Jazz Ensemble? To which Leon wrote back, he said, if Leon thinks that much of them, get them. And so we were there from Tuesday to Friday. The first day we had a 7-hour rehearsal, 6-hour rehearsal. Second day, 7 hours. The third day, 9 hours. And on the day of the concert, the kids were there from 10:30 in the morning till 1 a.m. We did the concert twice. There was a very famous musician, I think it was Les McCann, who was very, very sick. And everybody in the show donated their services to do a full afternoon concert and have all the proceeds go to Les McCann for his hospital bills. But we were there on stage from 10:30 in the morning to 1 a.m. with one break for dinner, half-hour break.
Ouch. That's a lot of fun.
And what happened from that was that a couple of months later, and my wife still is angry, I came home from work at the university and I flipped on the phone machine and I immediately recognized Quincy Jones' voice and said, "Ronnie, where is your ass? I need you. Call me. Phil Collins wants you to put together a big band for a big tour." So I called, got in touch with Phil Collins' musical director, Harry Kim, a wonderful, wonderful trumpet player. And 9 of my ex-students made up this 18-piece big band. And what happened was Phil Collins had always dreamed of doing a tour where he didn't sing, but went back to his roots of drumming, which he did with Genesis, and had all of his hit tunes up in the air, every tune you can think of, rearranged by 3 of the greatest arrangers. He had John Clayton and Sam Nestico, I think, I can't remember who the third one was. But they were all arranged so that every tune we played that night was a 2.5-month tour. Every tune would make you sound like Stan Kenton's band, Thad Jones's band, all the big bands, and then the Phil Collins band. And it was the greatest big. I was standing on the stage in Montreux, packing up my trumpet and standing next to Phil Collins. And I heard this guy say to Phil Collins, "I've heard all the big bands, Stan Kenton, Buddy Rich, Woody Herman. This is the greatest big band I've ever heard in my life." And it was the guy with the big bushy mustache, Crosby. Is it David Crosby?
Crosby.
Yeah, it was Crosby. Yeah. And when we were in Paris, we were playing, the only indoor venue that we played in all 2.5 months was in Paris at the Rex Theater. And there was a knock on our door which said Alumni Horns. That's what we were called. And Phil Collins said, "Some of the Rolling Stones are here. They want to meet you guys."
Amazing.
That's the kind of one concert that we did at the North Sea Jazz Festival in Holland. We were backstage about an hour from the concert, and one of my ex-students, Al Hood, great trumpet player, came to me and said, "Look who came to see us." And I said, "Who is that?" He said, "That's Earth, Wind and Fire." 10 minutes later, another student of mine who was in the band came up and said, "Hey, that's Tower of Power." And then the Cubanissimo, which took the place of Irakere in Cuba. So those 3 groups were all there at the same time.
Incredible. Ron, I know you're older than Keith Richards, but I know you look 30 years younger than he does. So,
we got to talk about the comedy club.
Oh no, we're going to get to that, but I want a couple other things.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Louis Armstrong.
Well, it was told to me when I was a young player, because I so much wanted to improvise, that for the first 10 years, Louis could not read music. Did you know that Buddy Rich could not read a note of music, the drummer?
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, all you had to do is play the chart. Phil Collins could not read music. When we were rehearsing for that Phil Collins tour, he had rented a whole theater in Lausanne, Switzerland, where we worked for 10 days rehearsing. And when the rehearsal would be 11 to 2, and then Phil Collins had a chef come in and cook lunch for everybody in the back of the theater. When they were all out of sight, I went up to Phil Collins' music stand. There was not one note of music in 27 charts that we were playing. Here's what it would say. It would say, "When the trumpets sound like down by the riverside, do this." He had little codes of his own.
Yeah.
And in 2.5 months, he never missed a beat. He was one of the greatest big band drummers I ever played with. But talking about Louis Armstrong, so it gave me encouragement about improvising, because if Louis couldn't read, how could he play so great? He had this fantastic ear, the feeling of the instrument. I have a 45-minute cassette tape that's downstairs of Clark Terry doing a 45-minute tape with me about he and Dizzy Gillespie. Every Saturday morning, they all lived within 8 blocks of each other in Long Island. And every Saturday morning, Clark and Dizzy would go to Louis's house and sit there with their mouth shut and just let Louis tell stories. And it was absolutely wonderful. He was divine. He was, he was the best.
And you got to play with him once, right?
No, he was he was at the Pines Hotel. He was on the featured thing when he had Hello Dolly was his big hit.
Right.
And we were in the dressing room, he was holding my trumpet. In that picture, he's got my Ben's trumpet. Oh, and I'm holding a Schilke C trumpet with a B flat bell, which was the first one that Schilke ever made. And the serial number is 3156, which meant it was March 1st, 1956. I was driving back from Dallas to New York, stopped at my Uncle Louis's house. He had that horn. He said, I can't afford it. You're going to buy it. So we keep it in the family. And I just had to put up the money.
How about your lessons with Rafael Mendez?
Oh, man. Rafael Mendez, when I was growing up, he was the man. Harry James was my idol because that's the first guy I really heard. But Rafael Mendez, when he came out with La Virgen de la Macarena in that movie. So when I was out on that tour with Cornelia Otis Skinner, it turned out that the conductor of the show became very close to me, Nathaniel Shilkret, Nat Shilkret. He was Raphael's boss at MGM, because at one period of time, Nat Shilkret was the head musical director at MGM. So I told him how nuts I was about Rafael Mendez. He said, when we get to LA, you'll meet him. The very first day we arrived, we had our own train for 8 months. We got to the hotel. He got a cab. We went to NBC Studios, I think in Burbank. And there was Raphael sitting in the band for a kiddie show called the Pinky Lee Show, which was a kiddie show. And he went up to Raphael and he said, this is my trumpet player with the show I'm conducting. I want you to take care of him. He said, don't you worry, Nat, I take care of him. So Raphael, after the show, drove me to my hotel. And then he said, here's my address. You'll be at my house 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So sure enough, I took the buses and got to his house in Culver City. I think it was Mentone Drive was his address. This is back in 1952, 53. So I get inside and he said to me, what do you want to study? I said, well, I want to learn to double and triple tongue the way you do. He shocks the hell out of me. He goes over to his stack of music in the shelf and he takes out the Arbin book and turns to page 155. Da, da, coo, dude. He said, just accent coo, but make sure that you make no space. To, do, coo, to, coo, to, coo. And then he went through, whole 8 weeks of getting it up to speed and fingering and stuff. And he was just a magnificent man. And I was so privileged to be invited to his 75th birthday party by Manny Klein. So I'm sitting at a table with Pete and Conti Condoli, and Pete's wife was Edie Adams at the time, and Manny Klein and I. And there are 400 trumpet players there at the Sportsman's Lodge in Studio City, and they've all brought their trumpet and they play Happy Birthday for Raphael. Amazing. Yeah. Amazing. Everybody was there. Billy May, Sam Nestico, everybody, was
incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Lou Soloff.
The only thing wrong with Lou Soloff was that he never realized what a genius he was. He really didn't. I have tapes of him doing his master's recital at Eastman School. Now, when he was up there, he was in a group with Vinnie and Alan Bazzuti, Jeff Tyzik. Harry Max was my roommate for 4 years in the Catskills, and he was in that group with the playing bass. And there was nothing that Lou Soloff couldn't do. And one of the funniest lines in my book was that night that he called me and he said he never met his idol, Adolf Herseth, and they were going to have a night off from Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and could I fix it up? So it happened to be a Thursday night, and Lou and I went and had dinner and then went to the concert. Unfortunately, the Schumann Third was the biggest piece on the program, but after the concert, he and Vince Chikowitz, Bud, Lou and I went to Miller's Pub underneath the L train there in Wabash Avenue. And as we're sitting there, it was so funny. I said to Bud Herseth, a lot of my students ask me this question. You play a concert Thursday night, then you repeat it Friday afternoon, you play it Saturday night, you take Sunday off, and then you play it Monday in Milwaukee. Now, Thursday night, let's say Petrushka. You've played it as well as anybody's ever going to play Petrushka on Thursday night. How do you get yourself back up to do it again Friday, Saturday, and Monday? And without hesitating a second, Bud Herseth said to me, I have never left the stage of any concert doing all that I wanted to the music. What are you going to say about that? I mean, you think about it. He had that. The first words that I ever said to Bud Herseth in my life was in 1954. He came through Tulsa with the Chicago Symphony Brass Quintet. So it was he and Schilke. Schilke was playing second trumpet. Phil Farkas and Arnold Jacobs playing tuba. I don't remember the trombone. So they said there'll be clinics. Mr. Schilke will be in that room and Mr. Herseth's going to stay in the ballroom. Can you believe everybody went with Schilke? It was just me and Bud Herseth standing in that big ballroom in Tulsa. And this, God's honest truth, I said the first words I ever said to him was, Bud, do you get nervous before a big solo? And he said, I get as nervous as the next guy, but it never gets above here. It never gets in here. And I said, how do you do that? And he said, well, if I can sit in my basement and practice something 15 to 20 times perfectly, I can't wait to get away from these four walls. I want to show people what I've been able to accomplish. So when I walk on the stage, it's with very good nerves. I can't wait to play. What else are you going to say?
And you guys were pretty close, and also you said you and Vince Chikowitz were very close too. Can you talk about Mr. Chikowitz a little bit?
Oh, you know, I probably miss him most of all. He's a sweet man, fantastic teacher, tremendous. At one point, I don't know how many people know this, but at one point he told me he was taking lessons with Schilke. And Schilke told him, you will never be a principal player. But if you make a change in your armature, you will be the best second trumpet ever. And he said, I had to make the decision. And he said, I decided to be the best second trumpet. And he made a big armature change. But his, if you listen to those old recordings, you know, Zarathustra and Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, and all of those with Bud and Vince, how could you get any better than that? Those guys just, you know, he had a special quality of, he was almost angelic, you know. When he and I met, I've never really told this to many people, but there were three people in my life that the love that we had for each other was so strong that when we'd see each other, which being musicians, you don't get to see everybody maybe for a couple of years or whatever. But Louis Bellson, the great, great drummer who was married to Pearl Bailey all those years, he and I became so close. I think when they buried him, he had the medal that I had made for him, which on the front had the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. And on the back, it said, between two men, no greater love exists. And so when I would meet Louis, without thinking twice, we would touch each other lightly on the lips. It wasn't a sexual thing. It was just, you want to show somebody, you know, that it's more than just love. It's more than that. It goes deeper than that. And three men in my life, Louis Bellson and Vince Chikowitz, and I had a great Italian piano player from New York named Al Catalignani, who was my pianist for 20 years in my quartet. And we were from the same kind of neighborhood. And, you know, you're lucky in your life if you can get that kind of love that you have to express it in some other way than just hugging somebody.
Yeah. Bernie Edelstein.
Oh, that's another angel who he started studying with my uncle Louis Davidson when he was 13. And he was already playing professionally when he was 16. I can't remember what he was with Reiner in Pittsburgh, or
yeah,
he came to Dallas after that. But when he died, and the International Trumpet Guild did a whole big section with a lot of people writing about him. The writing was so similar that this was a guy everybody looked up to. He had this incredible sound and gentleman-like quality. And he and his wife and Kathy and I were very, very close with another great trumpeter from New York named Al Stewart, Al Tandy, and 3 couples we used to go out. And then Vince Penzarella moved down to New York, and Vince Penzarella and his wife Setsko, the 4 couples used to go out all the time for dinner. And how can you even begin to imagine the stories that went on between, Al Stewart was one of the greatest lead trumpet players in New York, playing lead with Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman, and did Broadway shows. And he's another one. I got to take it back. There were 4 people that I kissed on the lips, and Al Stewart was one of them. And I kissed him in the hospital just before he passed away. He was sensational. What more could you ask for in your life than to have had a career where you were having these kinds of experiences? I never got up in the morning in all 28 years of teaching at Northern Illinois University that I wasn't excited about getting to school, getting to work with these kids. When people asked me after I retired, do you miss it? I said, the only thing I miss is the kids. I don't miss faculty meetings. I don't miss committee meetings. A lot of stuff I did, but the kids were it. That's where you learned. And you gave them love and respect, and they would give it back to you.
Well, Al was the next person on my list after Bernie to ask you about. So I'm glad you got that in. And the last person I want to ask you about before we get to your stand-up life was Ren Shilke.
Oh, man. Ren Shilke, I knew him at least 40 years. And I must have called him actually 6 times a year, about 6 times a year. And never once did it ever deviate. I would call him up and say, Ren, how you doing? Terrible. That was his say, terrible, with that tone of voice. And nobody knew how many trumpets and how many mouthpieces he gave people that couldn't afford, and how many students and players stayed at his home because they didn't have a place to stay. And he always gave this rough, gruff, image of himself. I don't know whether you remember this in the book, but he was not a great speaker. When he gave a lecture, it was very full of numbers and diameters. And well, this one ITG meeting at Bloomington, Indiana, he gave an incredible speech that night. I just thought it was the best he ever did in his life, and the audience loved it. And when everybody left, there were 4 people standing there talking to him, and I was waiting to greet him. And I don't know why, but I got it in my head that these 4 people were real Hoosiers, real country folk. So I started, it was a huge stage in Bloomington. I started to walk across, and just as I got within eye shot, Shilke looked at me and I looked at him, and I said, you don't know a damn thing about what you talked about. And I just kept walking. These 4 people just about fainted. They got white in the face, and he just did this, he waved his hand like, get out of here, Well, don't you know, the next morning at 9 a.m., the first clinic was me, Louis Davidson, and Charlie Colan. And immediately I took the mic and said, if the 4 people are out there, that was a joke. I love Ren Shilke.
Yeah.
He was absolutely magnificent. When I'd call him and ask him to do my bench trumpet, he'd say, why don't you put that damn thing in the museum where it belongs? But he'd do it. He'd do a whole overhaul.
Amazing. And did you sit on one of his trumpets once?
I did. I brought my Benj in to have it overhauled. He loaned me his personal trumpet, his own B4, B6, gold-plated Schilke. And I was giving a clinic with the quintet and forgot that it was there on the chair, and I sat down on it. And I just absolutely I was thunderstruck. It looked like a pretzel. You know, I'm 230 pounds there. And so I called the head of the shop at Schilke, Phil Warship was his name. And I told him what happened. And after he stopped laughing, I said, one of my students, Jesse Korn, is going into Chicago tomorrow. I'm going to send it in with Jesse. Please make it look like new. Please, please, I'll pay you anything. I don't care what it costs. So a year went by, 2 years went by. Now I'm going to have him do my E3L. I had an E3L. And I called him up and I said, should I come to the factory? He said, no, come to my home it was Wheaton, between Wheaton and Warrenville. Now he's never said a word about that trumpet. And he had a big, not a Rottweiler, but what was the other guard dog? The big, I don't know, but it was a guard dog.
Yeah.
Anna. And so I knocked on the door and I heard Anna growling like crazy. And so he opened the door slightly and he said, I said, here's my E flat. And he gave me a loaner E flat. And as I'm walking away, and he's waited 2 years to say this, he hollers at me, don't sit on that one or I'll tell Anna you're Jewish. Anna was a German breed. No, it wasn't a German Shepherd. It was not a Rottweiler, but it was whatever those guard dogs are. So he held it in. So I turned around. I said, Ren, when did you know? He said, the minute I got it back. He said, there's a part right here at the top of the bell that if anything ever happens, you can't repair it. You can't, not from my eyes. You may from the public, you know, people that don't know or not. But he said, I knew immediately. And I asked Phil Worship, and he told me what happened.
Amazing.
He held it in for 2 years.
That's a long time for a punchline.
Well, yeah, for a punchline, right.
And that's a good segue, because speaking of punchlines, you know, I remember when I learned that you did stand-up comedy in your retirement, I was really impressed. Can you talk about how that started?
Well, when I took my wife on our 10th anniversary, we went to Lake Tahoe, and we had never been to a comedy club. And like everybody else, we had heard that comedy clubs are very vulgar. The comics are very vulgar. It's very dirty. I said, let's go in. And there were 3 Canadian comics on that night. And every one of them was hysterical and not vulgar at all, and just really good humor. So when we bought a home in Bradenton, Florida in 2001, after a while, I said to Kathy, they have a wonderful comedy club here, I'm told, named McCurdy's Comedy Theater. So we went. It was on the route between Sarasota and Bradenton, and 41. It was on Route 41. We went in there, had a fantastic time. And a couple of times we went there, I met the owner named Les McCurdy. And just said, you know, I'd like to tell you a joke. So I told him a joke, and he absolutely cracked up, and he said, look, every Wednesday night, we have a thing here called open mic. Why don't you come in on Wednesday night? I'll put you up there for 5 minutes. See if the audience likes you and see if you like it. So I went up the next Wednesday night and I did 5 minutes, and the audience was knocked out, and he hired me that very next day. And I started out doing 10 minutes, maybe twice during the winter, during the 6-month period that we were in Florida. And then I worked up to now being called the guest comedian. So when we're in 21 now, but in January of 20, I did 7 shows in 5 days, starting on a Wednesday night, Wednesday, Thursday, 1 show, Friday, 2 shows, Saturday, 2 shows, Sunday, 1 show. So you do 7 shows in 5 days, which at my age gets to be, you know, And they always look at me when I walk out, because the audience doesn't know what the hell is this 86-year-old guy gonna, 85 then, but I have to work now sitting on a bar stool with a back on it because I just can't retain my balance as well. And when I start off, the first two stories, after the first story, and I never noticed this, a good friend of mine told me this, but after I tell the first story, all of a sudden the club becomes very quiet. Usually the clanking of glasses and people doing, yeah. I tell the first story and they love it so much that they get absolutely perfectly quiet. They don't want to miss. And my first story is just about, I come out and I say, everybody knows it's no fun getting old, but there are a few perks. Like this old man who went to interview for a job with a human resources manager, who immediately asked the old man in one word, "What is your weakness?" And the old man said, "Honesty." And the manager said, "I don't think honesty is a weakness." And the old man said, "You know what? I don't give a shit what you think." Then all of a sudden the audience is hysterical. And the second joke is the owner of the club, Les McCurdy, who comes from, I'll say it the way he would say it, because he's from Chattanooga, Tennessee, but he's got that Tennessee drawl. And I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so I tell the story about, Les told me one night he did a benefit at the Ritz-Carlton there, and he was a little late getting there. So kind of rushing through the lobby, he accidentally bumped into a woman and his elbow went right into her breast. And in his Southernly gentleman style, he said, "Ma'am, if your heart is as soft as your breast, I know you'll forgive me." To which she immediately replied, "Sir, if your penis is as hard as your elbow, I'm in room 231. And from then I've got him, and I can go through a litany of, I do a whole routine about being brought up in New York and the New York humor. And I do a whole routine about the Catskill Mountains and the Jewish stories, which are, just in a class by themselves.
Yeah.
But it's been 14 years now. This next year, if I get to perform, if the coronavirus is under control and we get down there, we usually go down there the end of October and stay until the beginning of May, mid-May. That would be my 15th year in a row. And our headliners have been all the Sinbad and Arsenio Hall and all top names, So I'm the one going out there before they go on. So I've got to be good. I've got to set that audience up for the headliner.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I'm sure those two jokes will get repeated a little bit after people watch this. So I hope so anyway. Ron, don't go anywhere once I sign off, but is there anything else you want to say? I mean, you've had an amazing life and you've been around so many incredible people. And
well, I'm just so happy. And, we've all had a terrible time getting through this period. But just as I told a beautiful young woman with 2 young children and her husband, and how hard a time they're having with this pandemic on Facebook. And I said, every generation, if you think back, every generation has had a major challenge. And this virus is our challenge. And luckily, now with the advent of the vaccine, we can at least see a glimmer of hope of perhaps by next summer or maybe a little later than that we will be back to some form of normalcy. Right. Now, I wrote that before this past Wednesday's action at the Capitol. But again, we're people who like to see the best is yet to come. And I truly believe that before I check out, I hope that Kathy and I will be able to see our family, be able to hug and kiss them, and be able to visit with friends. Ever since last March, we have not been in anybody's home, and very, very few people, if any, have been in our home. And we try to go by the rules. We wear masks when we go out. Now, We've got it down to going only out for medical appointments. We have our groceries delivered. We have food delivered from different restaurants. And we're trying our best, you know, at age 86 and Kathy is 78, we're in that underlying group of people. So we hope that we've signed up for the vaccine. We don't know when we'll get it here in DeKalb, Illinois, but we hope soon. And we hope this business with the capital will be resolved in the future. It has to be. It has to be. There's no other way around it. But I thank you for the opportunity to share these wonderful stories with your audience. And I hope it's brought them some happiness tonight. You know, how can you take all these memories? And it's so hard at night. I don't go to sleep till 12:30, 1 o'clock. That's my musician days. So, and I have all these old recordings. I've been listening to recordings that I and the jazz ensemble made back in 72, 74. So I always made it 2 years so there'd be new kids in the band so they could have some credentials, you know. And I told you, opera is my favorite form of music. So I have a lot of opera that I listen to. And as Kathy said, the second week of the pandemic, after they had locked us down, everybody in March, the second week, Kathy and I were having breakfast and she looked at me and she said, you know what, honey, I'm so glad we like each other. You know, and I thought, we've come closer than I thought we could possibly become. I thought we had the greatest love affair in anybody's life that you could ever have. And yet this has made us closer and closer. We've taken care of each other and tried to be as helpful and loving as we can.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Ron, I can't thank you enough. It's great to hear all these stories and amazing. And there's like so many people that have written, and we'll talk about it later, that are grateful for everything you've done for them over the years. And I want to thank Dylan Music and Yuka IQ, of course, for sponsoring these interviews. But thank you so much, Ron. It means
my pleasure. My pleasure.
So much.